thanks ever so much for joining us tonight. This was a bit of a gamble in some respects, trying to bring you together around this topic, but hopefully you appreciate the play on words here of tackling the blind side of CLM. There's at least two references to rugby there, but the operative word ultimately for this group is the subject of CLM, but hopefully we're going to have a bit of fun around contract management, the relationships between the two parties, the obligations, the implied, the expressed, etc. in contracts, and we've decided to do so in the context of the sporting world. So a number of you, I gather, are here partly because of that aspect of tonight, but hopefully we'll get into some practical matters. I've got three very learned individuals here. First to my left here is Roisin Craigan. I'll ask Roisin to introduce herself in a second. Johnny Badrock from Psych, and Toby Flood, who, for those of you didn't know, he's not only a former rugby player, he actually works for Conga, so he's here in that capacity, but obviously going to use his prior experience. My name is Gary Stimpson. I run I'll say, Northern European part of the Conga business. Toby is part of my team here, and I'm very passionate about the two things we're talking about tonight: rugby and contract management. So hopefully we'll have some fun and some passion expressed along the way, and we'll ultimately demonstrate the power of partnerships, power of teamwork. Rugby is a team sport, and today the two hosts are Conga and Psych Concilio. You'll probably mention that at some point, changing their name, but as partners, as a team, we believe that that it's a very strong team that would probably go on and win the Six Nations in the next month if we put 15 players on the pitch. But that's the other final point to just kind of settle everyone, is we've timed this hopefully perfectly. Yesterday, those of you who care enough to spend your time watching a docuseries on Netflix, they've launched their rugby series, a fly on the wall from last year's Six Nations. But of course, next week we start this year's Six Nations, and I know there's some Scots in the room who are going to be disappointed over the next few weeks. There's some French in the room who are entering the next few weeks full of joie de vivre, is it? Joie de vivre. But the majority of us, I believe, are English, and there's a South African here who frankly doesn't care. Is that right? But yeah, so we thought we'd time it now with the Six Nations about to join us. So thank you again for joining us. I will now pass over for each of you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll move into a kind of panel and Q&A.
Hi everyone, I'm Roisin Craigan. I'm a member of the commercial team at Onside Law, which is a law firm that primarily advises clients in the sports sector. So that's whether that's governing bodies, clubs, or individual athletes. So I advise on any number of contracts that any of those people may need, from organising major events to sponsorships to individual endorsement deals. And I have a particular interest in technology in the sports sector and data rights. So I work on player welfare in terms of medical research into injuries or injury prevention, but also things like data rights for broadcast and media, gambling, and fan engagement and anything kind of related to that.
Thank you. Thanks. Slightly less impressive resume from me, but I'm Johnny Badrock. I'm a chief legal engineer at Psych, so we're a key implementation partner for Conga, so helping organisations implement contracting tools to improve their processes. We do a lot of other work around legal operations, technology more generally. I'm a lawyer by background for my sins, but kind of recovering now, and spent the last 10 years helping lawyers to kind of improve their working lives through automation. Helpfully, I've got a little bit of background automating things like sports contracts as well, working with some of the big football clubs in the north of the UK. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on today.
Yeah, good evening everyone. My name is Toby Flood. I'm an account executive here at Conga in Gary's team and Stuart's team, as alluded to. Previously lived in a different guise of having an 18-year career where I just chucked the ball around and messed about for a decent period of time, which was great fun. But yeah, I apologise often when I'm on stage as well. I mentioned this before. I still have what they kind of call a colloquial language, so I might swear a little bit, so I do apologise. I know I'm mic'd up, but it hasn't quite left me. The transfer from being in a sporting environment to a corporate environment is still very much a work in progress, so I do apologise if I swear. Anyway.
So I know that Toby has done some of the corporate, hospitality type thing that the rugby players do, and of course they're encouraged in those situations to swear and tell stories. We might get a couple of those out as well. Okay, so moving on. So I mentioned obligations earlier on, and the player and the governing body or the club, have obligations to and from one another. And as we prepared for this, that kept coming up. Toby obviously got direct experience of that, but we talked about it through the health and safety aspect now, particularly in the rugby world. But as we talked about it, we all came at it from slightly different directions, but it was top of mind for all of you. Roisin, would you kind of build a foundation for us to kind of explore that subject, please?
Yeah. So, there are now fairly settled rules around the kinds of obligations that you can expect from individual athletes. So when you're looking at, for example, the Premier PRL in rugby or the Premier League in football, players will have a standard contract that they enter into with their club, which will then have a schedule of specific other obligations that they have to meet, which is where you'll find a lot of their media obligations, sponsorship obligations, and increasingly I think there's a bit of a view that clubs and leagues are on a bit of a mission creep in terms of what they're expecting from players. So that's a slight area of tension. And I think I was talking to Toby earlier about how he feels about maybe that players aren't necessarily aware of everything that they're signing up to when they sign this this agreement. So you'll see different levels of kind of sophistication. So a Premier League footballer will be very, very live to his obligations, whereas perhaps in a more amateur league or leagues with less funding, they may not be aware. So there's a real piece around player education in this area going on at the moment.
And as an observer of the various sports, increasingly it's less about the kind of unions as was, but there are these groups that then represent the players to protect them from their individual skill set being limited in this area, but collectively they can protect each other and support each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that will differ between sports. So you'll probably have recently seen that the Rugby Players Association, a lot of the England players have split from that in terms of the commercial obligations. The Players Association may still be involved in some of the pure employment aspects, but there'll be a separate agency representing them for commercial aspects. And there'll be a bit of a learning curve, I expect, from those players in having to engage advisors or learn about the kind of contracting process and what they can have there. I think some of that comes from a bit of tension between, at least in this country, a lot of those players' representation groups are funded by the governing body. So you'll see sometimes a bit of a curve in how far the representation group feels they can push. If they've just agreed their funding agreement from the governing body, then they feel like maybe they've got a bit more sway and they can push a few things. But if they need to go, if they know that they're going to need to go back in 6 months' time and ask for a huge amount more funding, maybe those fights become a little more tentative and they're less likely to push for that. At least that's a perception. So there is a tension there in the funding and what their obligations are.
There was a huge amount of tension. A huge amount of tension. It would kind of all boil down. This is amazing, I'm recording this, but I'll go with it anyway. During COVID, we were heavily let down by the RPA or the guys of our trade union. So, and then they will deny it, but ultimately what happened, well, certainly from a player's point of view, hence why the tension was because you were part of an organisation which you were contractually obliged to represent, and they would represent you and look after you. And I think there was this sort of unspoken word that was fine, that it was well managed. And during COVID, we were then requested by the union, but then also by the RPA to take pay cuts, which is, we understand there was no income, so we did that. And then it was started X amount, but then it dropped, and we sort of felt they were trying to protect us, or hoped they were trying to protect us a little bit from sort of having to cut really hard. And so people were taking 25%, 50% pay cuts during COVID, even though there was furlough and all this sort of stuff. And then it transpired that the RFU, the central governing body, actually were managing the contract situation with the RPA, and they were funded heavily by the union. And then it then rolled on a bit further, and even though we were taking pay cuts, the moment we opened up the doors again to having live content or content when there were fan engagement, our fees for being part of that union went up by 150%. So not only did we have to then pay for the privilege of being part of something that we didn't really feel they looked after us, and a lot more, it then transpired that they were being funded by the RFU. So there was a big fallout, and that's why the players are reacting the way they have, because they now recognise, and everyone has recognised, but they're the product, right? It's quite Marxist that you should stand up and leave a room and walk out and take your quality away, or take the entity away. But they realise the power they can, and they are going to learn, and they're going to have some horrible situations where they're going to get things really wrong, and they're going to negotiate and have a bad time. But that's kind of going to be part of the journey. To be able to control the commercial side of who they are, I think will give them a large amount of value going forward. But in terms of where they are RPA now, it's probably starting to fizzle out a bit, and it will become an England-driven or England player-driven contract negotiation with England or the RFU, and then we'll see what transpires on the back of it. But it's going to be quite tumultuous for the next few years, I think, until everything really settles down.
I mean, it can't be anywhere near as tumultuous as it was, however long ago it was. Was it 18 years or so ago when we went from amateur to professional, and then the England players revolted? We'll come back to that in a bit. But this stuff kind of occurs. There's two parties, each of which wants their obligations or their rights or their benefits to be achieved through this relationship, and the contract is clearly important in that, but so are motivations and aspirations and protections, etc. And you've kind of seen it at close quarters.
Yeah, I think you're dead right. Look, going back to that years gone by, but I remember them using the force, the power of sort of the group mentality of just, or herd mentality of getting up and leaving a room and that sort of stuff. So yes, it's hugely important, I think, to think that, to understand. I think rugby's been poor at that. When it transitioned from amateur to professional, the RFU got it wrong. They should have essentially contracted their players straight away, but they didn't. And now they're sort of in the process of maybe finalising that. So they've gone from paying X amount of money to a club for the honour of having that player represent their country, to now having the individual themselves recompensed for playing for your country. So there's been a slight change in the contract, but that has made a massive difference in how, or the ownership regulations of that player. So that player now is under the control of the RFU, whereas Ireland did this years ago and have reaped benefits from it, because they've got a situation where they control the player, they control the asset, they control exactly what's happening. And just a slight change in that contract made a huge amount of difference to actually the prowess of an organisation and the way it works.
We haven't prepared this question, but it's just kind of occurred to me. I'm from a generation that kind of saw that change from amateur to professional. Were there contracts before in the amateur days, or was it all brown paper bags and the chairman gave cash and 1 week it's a theft?
I remember Martin Bayfield telling me years ago that they used to rock up seriously on a Thursday night before an England match, and they would go out to train. And then they would finish up training, and then they'd go and have just a gentle 5 or 6 pints in the pub before a serious training session on the Friday, where they would have another gentle 3 pints in the pub before playing the match on the Saturday. So I don't think there was a huge amount of regulation, obligations or anything going on there. So I think it was quite lively. But yeah, I don't think there was. I think there was just a turn up and play. I think you'd just been selected and there was no contract in place for you to play for your union. I think that probably started when it went professional, between the entity with the RFU and then the clubs, and then there was obviously that sort of honouring of that agreement throughout that process when things went professional.
Yeah, wow. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You're slightly less informed on this specific subject, but you've seen it through other sporting situations. Is there anything we can learn from what you've seen and heard that perhaps rugby is still going through?
Yeah, definitely. I think let's bring it back to contracts and contract automation and things as well. But I think, a big part of my career, I spent time looking at kind of legal design, so kind of looking at the humanity of law, and I guess enabling people to kind of interact with law and looking at kind of user experience. In kind of a contract automation perspective, day to day, that's thinking about users of systems. But actually, we forget, in the industry that we're in, it's very much focusing on lawyers and how do we negotiate contracts better. But it's thinking about the end user of the contract as well. And so we think about sports players, and a lot of them very early 20s, sometimes teens. They're signing up to these probably 70, 80, 90-page agreements full of all kinds of obligations on them in terms of how they can behave in their life. clothing that we can wear, clothing that we can't wear, events we can appear at, events we can't, and we're expecting them to read a 90-page agreement, retain it, and understand what it actually means. So some of the interesting work that kind of I was doing with some of the football clubs before was how do we help to translate those contracts into kind of simple rules? How do we turn that into materials that sports players can actually read and understand and hopefully try and remember? So there's quite a lot that there's the contract itself, but there's all these kind of, I guess, materials that fall off that help people to understand the obligations and remember them, 6 months later, 12 months later.
Yeah, I mean that plays out day in, day out when we're dealing with this subject through our work, where organisations are saying, I've just got no visibility, I've got no transparency, I've got no control over the either side of that contract, the responsibilities we have, the opportunities that we have within those contracts, because invariably they're gathering dust in the bottom of the drawer. In your days, they gathered dust in the bottom of the sports bag, presumably, and
Yeah, I mean, there were so many times where I got a call from my agent saying, you've got to do 3 appearances in the next 48 hours. I was like, oh, okay, cool. So they're up and down to London, because you just don't think about that stuff. And I think also when you're playing, you're so immersed in performing for your organisation, you don't think about the need to do an appearance or turn up for something that a sponsor's paying X amount of money for. And I think I always remember there was a big change in the system. I was saying this before, when sort of after 2003, when Johnny kicked that World Cup goal, the contract at that time with England was get a player, so get Gary or get Rasheen and put them in front, and you can put any England stuff on them or any sponsor of England. So you could put, and Johnny notoriously was an Adidas player and was paid a fortune to represent Adidas as that individual. But Nike obviously figured out how they could break the rule there and have a little bit sneaky. So they would take Johnny, the individual, and put him up and plaster him in Nike, and then put him out on lots of magazines and lots of billboards. They may have been very clever the way they put the England jersey or whatever it may have been, but they were able to market Johnny as a Nike athlete, which was huge. So the fallout from that and that tiny bit of contractual sort of grey area, I think we all want to remember that Johnny and Adidas went really hard at England and changed that contract, so now it had to be represented. There was always 3 people in the room, so any obligation that you had to do for that, O2 or Nike or whoever it may have been, had to have been with 3 of you in the room. So it wasn't just that individual, that entity or that inside entity was trying to sort of take the mick out of the obligation of the outside entity.
So you touched earlier on this kind of the central contract or the hybrid contract that's coming on. It's just getting more and more difficult to bring those various parties together and manage the various responsibilities, obligations, opportunities, motivations, etc. Rasheen, you're seeing that through various lenses, from the commercial lens to the protection lens to the long-term interest lens. Or how are you seeing that evolve? I mean, you've worked with England, I believe, and we talked earlier on about the what's the Celtic one? I've got a mental block all of a sudden.
The IRF.
Yeah, yes, exactly. You've worked with these guys, haven't you? So you've seen this emerge.
Yeah. So I think the idea with the central contract is that it gives the union much more control over the players' development and their international obligations, and also the idea that it maybe will relieve some of the strain on the clubs, because I think everyone's aware that club rugby in England has suffered financially over the last year, perhaps. And it's a model that we've seen work in Ireland, but Ireland has the benefit that they have a much greater control over the league. But it's also something that we've seen work really well in English cricket. So English cricket national players are centrally contracted, and they're employed by the ECB and then seconded to counties for specific county obligations, and it's just given the ECB much more control over the development programme. It's not necessarily everybody thinks it's 100% amazing, because some of the counties will say, oh, well, we want a little bit more from our star players, but it's certainly something that has worked for cricket so far.
That's a really good parallel. I haven't thought of that. We talked earlier on about how the British Lions have just announced a ladies' programme for the British Lions for the first time. If someone said to me, what was your highlight in 2023, it would be when I learned that English cricket was going to pay the ladies at the same rate it was paying the men. And arguably their product isn't quite at the level in terms of the commercial aspects, but they said, do you know what, we want parity. Could you comment on that?
I think women's sport is really, we talk about women's sport like it's some homogenous thing, and it's not. It's going to be completely different depending on the individual sport and their priorities. So one of the great things about cricket is that they have gone for parity, and they're very conscious about making it kind of one of the most equal sports in the world. So you might have seen the 2 Ashes campaign last year, where they played the men's and women's Ashes alongside each other, and so they gave the men's and women's game equal billing, and that really worked in terms of uplifting both sides of the game in terms of its exposure and participation. That's not going to work for something like football, where the Men's World Cup is such a huge event and is so all-encompassing, similarly with the Premier League, so you won't see the WSL or the Women's World Cup in football merging together. So it just depends on what the priorities are. So you've got a bit of a blank slate in that you don't necessarily have pre-existing structures, but you're very much looking more to do with, well, what's our priority as a separate sport, as a separate entity? Our fans are different to another sport, or the men's equivalent in our sport, and our market's very different. So what can we do there that actually attracts and engages with those people? It's quite exciting.
It is exciting, and it's changed the pace. And I think, again, part of the contract model is, it's a long-term contract. We put it in the drawer, it gathers dust, and it matures over time. But the world is turning every day. New information, new influences that may inform that contract are changing every day. You felt that through various contract phases in your career, Toby.
Yeah, I think you do. I think you have an awareness of the obligations. I remember, when I left Newcastle, there was a standardised contract for that entity. It wasn't at that time; it was standardised across the RFU. I was too old, sadly, to have that standardised contract. But I remember going to Leicester, where there was supposed to be a standardised contract, and actually, I was told that anytime I played for my country, I was taken away from my club, and therefore I'd have to sacrifice my salary of 50%. And that was quite a new thing. And I think it was only at the time it was Leicester and Northampton that did that. And with that in mind, sort of, I remember balking at that because I'd never seen it before. The joy of having your cake and eating it too sort of scenario, where you get to play for England, but also the money's coming in from your club, where actually they cut it in half. And I remember, feeling a bit miserable about it, but it was the biggest club in England at the time, and I wanted to sign for them, all that sort of stuff. And so you did. And then you sort of learned that Geordie Murphy, who was an Irish player, I think he played 70 odd times for Ireland, trivial. But he was a bit of a legend, and it transpired that because he was cut his salary in half, and Ireland at the time was essentially contract but not paying very much, and when he went to Ireland he had to cover the cost of all the tickets. And remember, he's Irish, so he's got 4,000 members of the family, so he would cover the tickets, and and the whole town, literally Nace, would all come to watch him. So he was paying 25 tickets a game. So every time he played for Ireland, it was costing him about £500. So he's had 77 caps for Ireland, but it's cost him around about £35,000 to represent his country, which in the sense of a contract is not great for the individual. So the iterations of contracts have got better, and as you say, the ability to understand them and be aware of them. And I think the really good point about a footballer having really clear awareness of their obligations. One, probably they've had their hands and fingers burnt with that. Two, there's more money in it, so they're probably going to have a more specialised unit around them looking at it. Whereas we probably got a agent who, are lucky, has read law at some point and or has certainly seen contracts. So I think the as you say, the monetization of that sport has a huge impact of probably the obligation awareness and the performance in that contract that you have to be very candid or very honest about. And I think that in rugby, because it only went professional in '95, is still way behind the threshold in that.
So Johnny, again, you're slightly more detached than most of us, but let's kind of turn to the kind of parallels where they may exist between some of the points we've discussed here and the business world, and how the contracting motivations and challenges or whatever, how you're seeing those playing out.
Yeah, I think, and again, we can pull some of this back to sport. One thing that we've not talked about is, and I guess it's more prevalent in football than rugby, but things like transfer deadline day.
Just thinking about it.
So, contract automation is a huge thing there. Contract deadline day, pretty frantic day. You'll be negotiating a contract until 11, 12 o'clock at night, and then all of a sudden, 2 minutes before midnight, suddenly going to a different club on totally different terms, and you've got to quickly kind of respond and adapt to that. So, I've done quite a lot of work with football clubs looking at automating those contracts, building out kind of templates around that, so you can quickly pivot terms at the last minute and try and change that. I think one of the there's a lot. We talked a lot about player transfers. We talked a lot about player agreement sponsorships. I think one of the most fascinating use case I found working in sports, but I'd never really thought about before, was NDAs. And before you kind of roll your eyes at that, One of the really interesting use cases for the sports clubs was NDAs for staff of the players. So a lot of players that are coming in from overseas, the clubs sort out, houses for them. They sort out nannies, they sort out housekeepers. And so actually really tight, watertight NDAs for these staff, because actually for their staff to go and tell a story to a newspaper about who's been around the house or what they've been up to is obviously worth millions and millions. So one of kind of the really fascinating things for me was, when it says, oh, can you look at this NDA? I was like, great, this is really interesting. But when you start to get into kind of the concept behind it, a hell of a lot more interesting than probably any other kind of NDA use case that I've come across before. So
interesting, the remedies in that NDA contract.
I'm not allowed to discuss them. But yeah, so I think it's just, it's thinking about kind of sports. It's so much more far-reaching than I think people necessarily think about. So yeah, lots of interesting things to think about in terms of, it all comes back to obligations again and making people understand what it is that they're signing up for.
You use transfer deadline day. I'd kind of gone there in my own kind of quirky way. It's our end of year at Conga on transfer deadline day in January. So we'll be working until 11:30 at night, and Sky Sports will have someone outside the office checking on movements and feedback to the journalists. But there is a kind of practical aspect to that. Is when I first started selling tech, we were signing 3, 4, 5 weeks with contract negotiation in a room with I can remember one with a rather large bank beginning with B. Bringing some lawyer over from Hank Haney, I think his name was, over from New York in his Burberry suit, and we walked around their offices up in Manchester, and he was charging, I don't know, £8,000 a day or whatever, and we went through this whole theatre of this, and at the end we didn't agree. Actually, there was no contract at the end of it, but both parties committed all those people to spend all those days in hotels. One of the things that's improved immeasurably is, you talk about automation, but simplification, and also, the sense that you start with a contract that kind of makes sense. Discuss, please, panel.
I think, personally, one of the frustrations is when you get a contract that is so incredibly one-sided that no one is ever going to sign that thing, and you can waste inordinate amounts of time going back and forth with your ideal position, whereas actually 99 times out of 100 it's so much better to just say, look, this is a sensible position that works for everybody involved. I'm probably doing lawyers out of a fair amount of fees here, but
partly where I'm going with this topic.
But certainly, I think as well, working in sport, you think of it as being lots of people with a lot of money, but actually a lot of governing bodies or a lot of individuals that don't necessarily have huge amounts of resources to spend, particularly on something that isn't generating money necessarily, like legal advice. It can save you money, but it doesn't have an immediate benefit. So to spend a lot of time going back and forth with unreasonable positions is really, really frustrating. And it's much preferable from my perspective to just say, here's what we can do, and here's what we can't do, here's where our hands are tied. But ultimately, we all want to get to a place where we can make this deal work.
We talked about the classic stereotype, the 19-year-old footballer represented by an agent or whatever. They're probably a little bit vulnerable to that, but equally these agents have inserted themselves to kind of manage that straight away. I mean, Toby, did you ever sit the other side of the table with something that just did not make sense?
No, good question. I think a couple of times when we negotiated a couple of player increased salary stuff at England, when we went there, and there was times they were quite hardball and they wanted to try it, and they wanted to change the amount of times that you had to appear and you had to do excess obligations, I guess, for want of a better word. But in general, I think because of the nature of sport and the way that they knew that the players are the most important, they were the product, they had to sort of bend a little bit, and they were never that difficult to manage. I think they would draw a line, and then you would find the Zopa eventually because they'd been quite difficult. So I think actually they are pretty good. I just think COVID, going back to that sort of original story, that was when the shackles came off, and actually players realised how they can commoditise themselves and how they should change those contracts. Because it fundamentally worked pretty well. There'd been a scaling up of revenue in the RFU and in the product that we were producing, and there was increasing revenue year on year. When COVID hit, it sort of actually opened up the cesspit of what rugby was at that time, and actually as we saw clubs fall apart and contracts being lost and situations were pretty difficult for players. But actually, I think what it's done is also cleared decks a little bit, and I think now the contract situation is much cleaner and much better at this moment in time if you speak to those players.
You mentioned COVID a couple of times. Again, we've not prepared for this, but it's reminded me in so many ways of how this topic has become more relevant. COVID, organisations wanted to know what force majeure clauses they got, what issues they got around, whether they got contracts that actually touched on pandemic and whether it's on your favour or your risk. Since then, we've had the interest rate change, and organisations want to understand whether that is a risk or an opportunity, etc. I mean, Johnny, you must have spent a lot of time helping organisations to surface that intelligence and monetise it in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's been the story of my life, kind of the last 3 years. At Psych, I set up our kind of AI and data services practice. So the first 2 years of that was helping organisations try and deal with COVID before realising we couldn't actually find the contracts in the first place. So it's like, we've got great technology, we've got AI, we could get the answer in 2 days, but give us the contracts. So it's, there's some in a drawer over there, there's some in an off-site centre 3 miles away, but we can't get access to. So I think it's a big thing around digitisation at the minute and building a foundation. So there's some great technology out there, but we've got to do the absolute basics first. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of organisations are kind of underestimating at the minute and see it as a bit boring and unsexy as well. Yeah. So we kind of talk about AI and it's like, great, but actually let's fix the foundations first. Let's get our house in order. Let's work out where our live contracts are. Let's make sure that we're storing them in the right place to begin with and investing a bit of time and money in that. Whilst it's boring, it's kind of the key thing to start.
I know that over my career, going back to my kind of illustration earlier on, I've left the company and I've got the signed contract in the bottom drawer of my desk, and I've left the company, and no one has asked me to hand it back or point out where it is, and at no point has anyone got it. In other words, we've moved a little bit beyond that. But Rasheen, you must have seen how increasingly now this relationship between the various organisations in industry are very sensitive to that. You can't allow the rugby player to just put it in his sports bag and forget about it, or the footballer to not respect their obligations, etc. I mean, how do we shine a bright light on that for everyone's benefit?
Organisations are just getting a lot better at being organised, basically, and we always it's always a good idea to have a central deposit for your contract, I guess, and we often get sent the final copy as well, which is very helpful because then if anything does come up, someone else has got it. I'd say in terms of players and athletes are becoming much more aware of their rights and their obligations, and they are becoming much more aware of clubs or leagues or unions trying to ask more and more of them. An area that we see this a lot in is in data rights particularly, and I don't know if people have heard of Project Red Card, so it's effectively a group of people group of ex-players, managers, who are becoming more aware of how organisations that maybe aren't directly related to the sport are using their data and making money off of it, primarily targeting gambling companies or other data companies that are harvesting huge amounts of information about them, making money, and then the players aren't necessarily receiving compensation for that. And that's kind of rumbled on for a few years, and it hasn't necessarily, we haven't kind of reached the zenith of it yet, but I think it's a really good example of how people are becoming more aware of things. And I think it's just about player education as much. You were talking earlier about how do we make those contracts make sense. And there are some areas where there are established protocols, like not using more than 3 players, not overusing a single player. And that's become much more ingrained in general practice. But there's certainly a lot more that organisations could do to actively educate their players.
As you say that, I'm reminded of our earlier conversation about gum shields in rugby, and how the technology has got to a stage now where these gum shields are intelligent enough to in some way recognise the force that has been imparted on that body and the jaw and the head, etc. And increasingly, in this sport particularly, we're worried about the health impact of that. But you were saying that even then, there's players that are worried that the data that's being harvested there is going to be not necessarily used against them, but it's for someone else's benefit. And yet fundamentally the reason why this has been created and organisations are promoting it is for player welfare.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's a project that I've worked on for a long time, and I do think it's really important, and it is really beneficial for the sport as a whole and those players. It's all set up so that we can find out more about what the consequences of these impacts are and how best to get those players the help that they need. But there is real sensitivity around just that fear of, are you going to go and take what is really quite personal information and sell it? And again, it's an education piece. It's about making sure that every single one of your stakeholders really understands what you're doing and why you're doing it, because they're not forced to wear these mouth guards. We still have to convince them that it's a good idea for them, and it's really just about that and getting everyone on the same page with what I think at least is a really good project.
Yeah. I mean, Toby, you'll have played with some of the players that are now making claims against their clubs and regulations, because I don't want you to go into anywhere that's uncomfortable, but you know, you must have some understanding of both parties' positions with that.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I mean, I think some of those individuals are really struggling. I saw Steve Thompson a couple of months ago, and he, you know, it's fairly apparent that he's in a situation which is pretty tough, and other players too. I guess the key to that, and Rasheen and I were talking about before, it's how you can prove that World Rugby or the power that be, if the RFU or whoever, knew that what they were doing was going to cause issues. Look, and I think there's this weird thing, and people talk about often. I went to get something from the drawer the other day, and I couldn't see it. I closed the drawer and I walked off my wife, and I was like, "Where's the masher gone?" or whatever it was, and my wife said, "It's there." And so there's that weird thing. Was that just me doing a man look? Do you know, like you're like having a little bit of look, I can't find that. Do you know, like I move and walking on, or is that my brain kind of going? Shouldn't be telling this my boss, by the way. My brain's let me tell. I find it straight away. But no, the point being, so there's a little bit like, so there's always that bit in your back of your mind that kind of goes, geez, because I had a fair few, and you think, and we talked about before about this sort of the base layering. But I do think if they can prove that the RFU or World Rugby knew that you were putting these individuals at risk, you know, there might be a case there. And I was saying before to Rasheen that we used to practice on a training field, clearing people off the ruck, right? So somebody stood over a ruck and you had to move them out of the way, and just rather than hitting them, we used to be taught to grab their neck, their head and their jaw here, and then you would roll them out the ruck as fast as you can. So you would have a human being and you would grab their neck and their head and turn it as fast as you can, because where the head goes, the body follows, is what our coach used to say. And funny enough, it did, right? So you'd move, but you can't do that anymore, funnily enough, it's banned, who'd have thought? But we would practice it on a Wednesday, happily, as a group. You know, we'd sort of go, oh, of course we'll do it, that was net roll day, and off you go. And so you think, like, where rugby's going to with this data, you're like, oh, net roll day, of course, I get to see the chiropractor on Tuesday, you know, that sort of thing. So, but that just shows you that, you know, you've got this ridiculous amateur day where they used to stand on each other and you know, cause, you know,
just to be clear, that was rugby training and not Conga sales.
Yeah, that was exactly. Yeah, that's soon to come. Yeah, I'm going to get a few of the guys to do it. We're going to Vegas soon. It'll be fine. But the point being is, yeah, and I think that's where it's been a huge transitional change within the sport on the field, but also off the sport with the contracting side of things and how you manage players. And I think there is that time in that moment in time, probably 2004 to 2010, where if World Rugby knew the danger they were putting those players in, and they were aware of that, and I know that's very hard to prove in a court of law, then there is obviously a case to say you were putting us at danger willingly and knowingly, and then that they are going to get a payout. And look, it happened in the NFL. It's a very different context because it was, you know, head-on-head contact and you weren't looking at the ball, but there is certainly the pressure on World Rugby at this moment in time to navigate that as best they can. And obviously you guys are far more learned than I am about that, but from a player point of view, there's certainly some weight behind it and some pace gathering.
Thank you, Toby, because obviously a delicate subject, but I kind of wanted to go there to then reflect on the fact that, you know, again, the world has had to react to that. The contracts, the two parties have a slightly different position now to what they had before, what they would accept, what they would demand, etc. You know, Johnny, have you seen anything kind of in that way? You know, perhaps if we turn to, you know, B2B in a way, just how in 2023 post-COVID with GDPR, with you know the various forces, have you seen a pace of change that is, you know, is synonymous with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things, isn't there? I think, I guess a couple of examples. One of the things you talked about was responding to COVID and force majeure clauses, inflation, interest rate rises and things. And I think, organisations are now getting into a position where they just want to kind of contract quicker and on going back to kind of reasonable terms and things. There's concepts like one NDA, which has come around, which is trying to get people to a more reasonable position. And I think, I guess a couple of kind of climate things changing this. One, people want to spend less money on lawyers, but equally lawyers are getting a lot more, I think, collaborative than probably lawyers were 20 years ago, and actually seeing it more as we're seeing more of a team sport amongst law, even between kind of opposing sides. And I think that is changing quite a bit, and I've certainly seen that over the last kind of 10, 15 years. And I think automation and things driving that a little bit, because people are starting to realise that you can get to like a standard position much more quickly. But I do think there's a kind of a culture in society we're seeing that. And I think some of it comes down to cost savings. People don't want to spend as much money on lawyers. So actually, rather than start this really unreasonable position and spend £100,000 on lawyers negotiating it, how do we start a little bit closer and probably save ourselves 70 grand? I think that's, it comes back to reasonableness and bargaining power of the parties and things as well.
Yeah, brilliant. You've taken us to our last topic in that we talked about automation, talked about the pace of change or whatever. We're now going to talk about AI and the opportunity that's there, the threat that's there, the confusion that's creating, whatever. I know in your different ways you've got quite strong views and experiences in that area. Roisin, do you want to kind of lead us off?
So I think from our perspective, where we see AI used a lot is in things like player analytics, whether that's injury prevention or finding ways to treat injury a lot better, scouting, a lot of things around that, but also in stadia kind of projects where you're figuring out like crowd flows and how you can better set up a stadium using that data. But one thing that we always talk about is how important your data sets are in AI. Your algorithms and your software is going to be no use to you if you don't have a meaningful data set. So we often are advising on how you can acquire that data legally, whether that's personal data and you're looking at like GDPR regulation, or whether it's licensing from organisations like Opta or other similar ones. So that's probably where most of our advice comes in, and kind of filling in a lot of the gaps. So particularly on the women's side, there's a real dearth of data, and figuring out ways that we can try and fill a lot of the gaps there is also something that we look at a lot.
Johnny, we talked this morning with our two teams together about how, I'll say ill-informed the kind of demand is, but it's this bright shiny object that the magpie wants to pick up, and so we've got to kind of help with that. I mean, again, can you comment on how you're seeing it play out and what's realistic? I mean, we did a webinar last week. AI without the BS was the kind of title. I mean, there's a lot of BS out there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely a lot of BS, and I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. I think people are selling dreams and selling solutions that aren't necessarily there yet for all kinds of different reasons. But I think also it's quite damaging because there's a lot of very good AI technology out there. There's a lot of very good use cases of AI inside of legal. And I think the hype that that I've seen over the last 12 months, it gets incredibly boring talking about generative AI. I do that on a lot of panels, and a lot of people have started using, I think, AI as a verb as well. So it's almost saying, "What can we AI?" And it's like, I don't think that's going back to what you said before. Start with a problem and then think, what are the tools to solve it? But there are some really good use cases. Some of the, I think, most successful projects that I've done in a B2B setting over the last couple of years are things like revenue leakage, revenue optimization with organizations. So we talked a lot about obligations today and a lot about putting contracts in a drawer and forgetting about them. And a lot of kind of legacy contracts, using AI to extract all those obligations, codify them, put them into a simple manner. We've helped organizations realize just how much revenue they're leaking. So over the last few years where the economic climate has been a bit more difficult, rather than just focusing on kind of sales and how do we maximize kind of outbound, how do we maximize the value in the contracts that we've already got? So looking at things like, have we actually enacted on price increase mechanisms inside of contracts? Have we done that? Have we, as inflation's increasing, can we cancel our contracts, or can our suppliers cancel our contracts? And those looking at, have we renegotiated our terms because we're now out of contract? So I think there's a lot going on that AI can genuinely make a massive difference on. And we've had projects where customers have spent not even that much money with Psych, £50,000 to generate about £2 million of savings. Like the ROI on that is incredible. So this, I think AI is getting a bad name at the minute inside of legal and a bit of a bad rep because people are getting a bit bored and there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of kind of new startups that appear and then disappear and people get a bit disillusioned with it. But there is a lot of value there if you're using it in the right way and for the right use case.
So Toby, you didn't need AI to tell me how many times you played for England and how many points you scored or whatever, but do you think you might have played more often? You think you might have been, well, if it wasn't for Johnny, you would have played more often. I mean, that's the first issue you've got to deal with. But with AI, could you have played more often? Could you have scored more points, do you think?
No, it doesn't really help you on the rugby field. Sadly, AI, but I do think it's a fascinating topic. I think pulling apart your game data and how you would analyse stuff, and I think there is systems sitting in the back of analytical robots or when you're coding something to get your report after a game, which our analysts would be doing live, that now there is tech that sits behind it will do it instantaneously, which is pretty impressive. So you've almost taken the analyst out the play really. So that not only is the analyst sort of removed a little bit and he's having to cover it and make sure it is X, Y, Z, but the coach now is getting almost live feedback of what's happening. So you're getting that almost F1 appeal of live feedback data as a rugby coach, and I think that, or as a sports coach, and I find that quite fascinating to think that you can make, and they will make decisions to take players off X, Y, and Z based on data and data alone. Data gleaned from training of power output, etc., etc. So, look, I think it goes back to that topic of circles back a little bit to how we started about data being the all-empowering, encompassing thing. And if you can glean that data and the data is solid, then you've got a way of actually pulling that apart. And like South Africa won the World Cup through playing with data, right? And it was a very heavily data-driven organisation. Certain people will come off. I know there's a couple of South Africans in the room, or one from Zimbabwe, but you've got to admit that. But the point being is, I think you get that feeling where if that's the key driver, then it shows you the power of managing that and having an awareness of that, which is critical to one, obviously, sports performance, but two, I guess, off-field performance as well.
So the first time you were on the pitch and you looked up into the stands, as the cameras tend to do, and there's a guy there with a laptop, do you think he was playing solitaire, or do you think he was actually doing something meaningful?
It's just weird when they point at you and just start doing that. That's you get a bit worried. I think it became a huge part. When I first started, it was quite naive and quite raw, and no one quite knew what to do with it. And then over time, they've managed to sort of manifest these data sets which show you a huge amount of knowledge in the game, and actually then sort of put you in a system where, and I think, don't get me wrong, I was never a huge fan of it, mainly because it made me look bad. So that was the main reason I didn't like it. But moreover, it was, you can then become very self-reliant, and it takes the human side of it out. Always outputs drop, but actually they still could go and do something because of fatigue level or whatever. So I think there's that crossover of it. But yeah, it's certainly becoming, analytics and data is becoming the biggest part of sport and decision making.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're not at the stage where your jobs are being replaced by, it's not movie level AI. These are very much tools to help existing people in their jobs do those jobs quicker or easier, rather than it's not going to be rugby by AI anytime soon. just thought I'd give you
Yeah, sometimes it looks like that when England are playing because it's so stodgy these days. But there we are. The Scotsman nods at that point. Thank you. Right, I'm going to open the floor and offer you the opportunity to kind of involve yourself with some of the topics and some of the group. Has anyone got any questions? Ian. Oh, another Scotsman. There we go.
From a players, I'll do the players' point of view, I guess. So from my side of things, I think when you've got an agent, you sort of know the X, Y, and Z are in the market to look at you, and so when your contract is coming up, you have an awareness of time and date and all that sort of stuff, and so there's maybe 4 or 5 clubs, 0 clubs, whatever it may be, looking at you, and then it becomes that intent to purchase. So then the conversation and the sounding out happens. You then probably get an awareness of what they're willing to pay and what they want to do. And then I think when you decide to make that decision, then it really starts to roll very quickly. And then you have the conversation about salary, obligations, appearances, etc., etc. And that's probably where the players start to get involved. And the difficult thing is sometimes in my career it happened in a room, which was great because you were sat there with 5 or 6 lawyers in the room and you're talking about it, you're pulling it apart and you're having conversations live. The worst one was when I signed for France, which happened remotely at the time, and we'd sort of agreed it and dotted it, but they asked us not to release that information because it was still very much material information that I'd signed. And somehow it got out, and it was probably via a friend or whatever, and it went out and it hit the news, making myself more important than I am. But they then responded very quickly and swiftly, said, look, if this is how he's going to act, we're going to pull the contract. So they thought I'd obviously released it. We didn't have to scurry around and try and create a situation where I didn't release it. It obviously came from X, Y, Z. So that's probably as dangerous as it gets as a player, because it's mainly, firstly from my point of view, it's mainly quite managed by your agent, and you have that trust and relationship with them. You will pick through things apart and you will go through those processes, but the battle, I think, is run by the agent, and the agent will then normally sit there and fight for you in a room, and that's probably where the aggressive part happens. It's certainly in rugby where the head coach will sit there and the legal team will sit there with the agent, and the agent, they'll try and thrash it out as best they can, and that's probably where it gets quite heated, depending on obligations and pay and all that sort of stuff. I mean, from your side?
Yeah, so I personally don't do a lot of player transfer work, so I'm not sure I can give you all of the inside scoop that you're looking for, but I mean, broadly speaking, it will often depend on the individual and the clubs involved. So someone like a Jude Bellingham has a lot more kind of sway that he can walk in a room and say that this is what I want from you, versus like someone who's maybe playing in the lower leagues, where it's much more formulaic. There will be minimum requirements that any club will expect of any player, but it's much more linked to that thing that we've talked about already about not overutilising a single player. If you're a club sponsor, you're a club sponsor, not a player sponsor. They'll have their own individual arrangements, so all of that will feed into it. So it will broadly depend on the specific circumstances.
Yeah, one of the topics we'd actually prepared for tonight, unfortunately, Alistair from Psych is on his back at the moment with pneumonia, I gather. Alistair, in his earlier career, actually managed Theo Walcott's move from Southampton to Arsenal, but until about 11 o'clock in the evening of the midnight deadline, he was signing for Chelsea. And at 11 o'clock, he was instructed to change the other party and presumably had to change some of the terms between the two parties. But there's only an hour. In that hour, broadly, the two parties got to agree on what's already been constructed. I'm commenting on behalf of Alistair, but he's shared the story with me. I guess there's a point at which logic prevails and deadlines kick in, but the two parties still have to agree. I mean, we've seen these other players hanging around outside the club and nothing happens, and they go back to their current club prior to that. But the Owen Farrell one recently was kind of got leaked, and then everyone went, no, it's no news. There's nothing happening there. I mean, it's inevitable with the modern world, with access to so many people's movements, and I mean, he was seen coming out of the airport. I think.
I remember. Yeah, he was actually. I think, and it's quite hard to hide that. And I remember, again, if this was somebody more important, but I remember going to meet Jackie Lorenzetti, who runs Racing 92 decades ago when I was playing, but. He flew over on a private jet, came over to have a meeting with a couple of players. I ended up being one of them at the time. I must have been all right at the time. And I remember having to try and navigate through the security at the airport, the small airport, but actually I wasn't allowed to go through because I didn't have any ID, because they hadn't, being French, they hadn't told me you need to bring ID. So I just sort of rocked up, like wearing a tracksuit or whatever, and they were, oh, you need ID. So they then let me through, but those individuals on the gate, etc., in the sort of private airport, had that been a Theo Walcott, had that been a Jude Bellingham, that's going to the press straight away. Jude Bellingham is going to sign at Racing, whatever it may be. So I think it does depend on the profile of the individual, but you're certainly right. I think being able to hide things now, as you touched on the NDAs with nannies, etc., it's so difficult to hide a contract or a contract negotiation or somebody that's going to do something, because it takes one tweet or one X or whatever it's called these days to get out there, and off it goes, right? It's wildfire.
I mean, I guess that's playing a part more and more in contracts now, the whole social media responsibilities and opportunities, etc. I mean, have you seen that evolve in recent times?
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, you'll have obligations to your club, but you'll also have your own individual deals that you do. And it's something to go back to the point we started on again about being aware of your obligations. Like, you can't necessarily tweet in the same way that you might have done, because you'll have a particular image that you're having to protect, that brands may or may not want to be associated with. So it just all goes back again to that same point that we've talked about a lot, about being aware of what you can and can't do, and that education piece and players becoming more aware. I just thought of something as you were talking about players staying at the club, and another thing that we're seeing a lot more of, to talk about data again, is players using data from companies to demonstrate their own value. So we saw it a few years ago with Kevin De Bruyne, and in January Alex Greenwood did the same thing, both at Manchester City, to renegotiate their contracts and demonstrate their value, not just in that team, but also, well, if I move to Bayern Munich, I'll be way better at Bayern Munich and you'll have to play them in the Champions League. And obviously that's something that's only available to a really kind of upper echelon, perhaps, of player who's got the resources available. But it's just another example of how players are becoming more aware and more involved in their own negotiations.
I guess a lot of that data is more and more democratized now, so it's actually more accessible, more generally available. You mentioned Opta earlier on, those statistics are kind of out there. I guess, the whole negotiation is going to pivot on that now,
Yeah, and different levels of player will have different access to different types, like there might be more generic sets, so like that personalised view that De Bruyne got won't be available to everybody, and obviously the downside might be that actually it shows that maybe you're not that great a player, but that's kind of the risk you take, and it's just an interesting other way that we're going to see players be more active in their own futures.
Wow. Any more from the floor? Malcolm.
Well, so my involvement does come primarily up to the point of signing, because I'm negotiating it, and usually when it's signed, it's kind of off with the commercial teams to implement. But part of that process is making sure that you are talking properly with the people who are going to have to action it going forward, so that they know exactly what they have to do. And hopefully I never see that contract again, because the other way I might see it is that it's turned up in my disputes team, and I don't want anyone reading my contract. So I don't know if maybe you've got more of an insight into this.
I mean, to be honest, it's the primary use case is for CLM. It's how do you actually bring a contract alive and get value from it throughout the life cycle of a contract. So I think, historically the cynic in me thinks that contracts are there, and if they get litigated on, that's when there's an issue about it. And if not, then they sit there until they kind of die, and sometimes well beyond. What we're seeing with CLM now, and lots of good use case with organisations, is that live tracking of obligations. So picking out the key obligations from a contract, mapping them and assign them to people. So there's actual kind of workflow that's now sat in the system that says the minute that this happens on the contract, automatically notify X, Y, and Z team, and make sure that the commercial team, whoever it is, are actually acting on it. So they are now becoming, through these systems, kind of living, breathing things rather than just a piece of paper that sits in the drawer. So that might be, renewals coming up. It might be, we talked about the sports contract, but it's actually that reminder, Toby, you've got to do 3 appearances in the next, rather than that being, you've got to get around the country in the next 24 hours because we've forgotten about it. Actually, we'll be thinking well in advance and be preparing for that. And it works on both sides, kind of a receiving party and the giving party, but it's allowing people to, all that money that we spend negotiating it and thinking about what the obligations are, it's actually making sure that we follow through and see through on it. We could talk out. I mean, and that's the interesting thing about it. In any contract, there's probably hundreds of obligations. So it's actually how do we? If somebody said, "Can you extract the obligations from our contract?" It's like, well, we can, but there's probably like 200 of them. Which ones do you actually? So it's thinking about kind of where's the value add. But we could talk about that afterwards.
Yeah, I was with a Eastern European bank yesterday on this subject, and the head of procurement talked about Nirvana, his view of Nirvana, and I'm saying we are a million miles away from it. Think about the practical issues we've just spent the last 2 hours talking about, and that's where you want to get. I get that's your North Star almost, but just maybe in 10 years' time you'll get there. But in the meantime, there's revenue opportunities, there's risk mitigation, and that's a big issue for banks and the like. But so much of that is lost in the bottom drawers of the company, and if all you do is expose that and maintain that's got to be goodness. There was a couple of hands up.
Yeah, so whether it it's a good. The bit I'm going to stick on is to begin with is whether it impacted you on the field, and it very rarely did, because I think there's this fundamental thing where you are, a sulky bugger because the contract's not gone your way, or there's an issue with the contract, but there is still that huge professional side to you as an individual that no matter what you're doing, you're going to perform and play as well as you can on that day, and you're still going to prepare the same way, because fundamentally it's your career, and you know, the person in the stand doesn't care if you've got a contract dispute with a club or about something else where actually performances drop. Well, then on that segue, that does happen, right? If sometimes people are going through contract negotiations, they don't feel they're getting paid right, well, that it's stalling, then you can see around contract time in rugby, which is normally sort of December to January, some players will slide a little bit because they're frustrated, because they're upset, because it's starting to eat into their daily process. But there is still that mantra that you should perform. The only time I really got caught out, I say really caught, was this sort of clause that England had about a couple. One was they were not sponsored by Red Bull at the time, and I used to drink Red Bull before a game, and I had sort of like a little gentle contract, like we'll look after you, we'll take you to really some fun events, etc., etc. We'll take you up on aeroplanes, all that stuff. And I was 23, I was like, I'm in for this, whatever it is. So they said, well, if you just sort of drank the Red Bull when you came out at Twickenham, like, would that be all right? I was like, yeah, of course it is. Like, not really thinking. And then for 3 games, he did it, and then we had a sit-down meeting like this, and it was like, you cannot, whoever you are, and they obviously knew it was like 4 of us, you cannot drink Red Bull out and say, okay, fine, so we're going to wrap them up. But it made it worse, because ultimately you then had this like sort of paper wrapped Red Bull can that everyone realised was a Red Bull can, so it just made it even worse. So they were stood there like singing the anthem or whatever, walking out, and then you're drinking that Red Bull, and they were obviously fully aware what you're up to, but they couldn't stop you because they'd sort of protect their claws. And there was another time where I got done for mimicking an England shirt in a magazine. So I had like red shirt, sorry, it was a Welsh player, white shirt was England, and then obviously Scotland and whatever. And they sort of had it like page by page, and I got there was a small clause that I didn't know about, that you were not allowed to sort of assimilate to be playing for England. And even though I was just wearing a white top, because of the way they put it in the magazine, it looked like, it obviously was done on purpose, but it looked like you were being sort of portrayed as an international player, and that was the rights of the RFU. So I got taken in front of a room of like 5 or 6 lawyers, and I eventually got a suspended fine, all that sort of stuff. But they're the things I think you miss, and they're the things, fortunately, don't really affect you on the field, but they're the bits I think, if you're not fully aware, that you can cause a lot of trouble. And that certainly happened where players have been fined for, I think about 2011, where people jumped off boats and chucked horse around, all that sort of. I'm being recorded on it, I forgot about that. Well, actually, it is that common knowledge. It is common knowledge. Forgot about that. Lucky I stopped. And they got fined for bringing the game into dispute and all that sort of stuff. So that then impacts on the field. But I think you just don't really have a great awareness when you're playing of the clause. You sort of sign a contract and you move on, and then it's not until you're sort of pulled up in front of a jury that you realise, shoot, I really need to read these. And I think it probably takes that first failure as an individual to then sit down and really nail down that contract.
Interesting, the clarity point. If I grab hold of the clarity point, we talked about an example this morning in the subject of AI, and how much can you trust it? And there was an example by another vendor in the market of doing an AI query around termination of convenience, and brought it back and said, there you go, there's termination. And I went, a lawyer, sat down and went, that doesn't amount to termination for convenience, but that's probably all that was in the contract that even touched on the subject. So clarity, how the hell is AI going to interpret that in the short term?
I think some of that ties to the last question, what Toby was just talking about as well. There's hundreds of obligations in a contract. Even the best system in the world, how do you track all of them? So, in a commercial context, there's things like most favoured nation clauses, which give you a right to kind of a best price with the other side, and so if they do a better price with another customer, then you're automatically entitled to it. Things like that, having an annual reminder to be talking to your customers, making sure that you're getting the best deal. Quite simple to do. Thinking about kind of Toby's contracts and going down to that really specific thing around imitating. Like, how do you can't govern to kind of have reminders or prompts or whatever it might be. You can't bring every single clause alive and bring it up to somebody's attention all the time, because there's just an overload of information. So there's kind of there's a balance of you can't.
And you've just reminded me, thanks, there was a clause in all contracts that were standardised there was a 6-month injury clause, and it was a consequential, so like day after day after day you were injured, but then it became cumulative. So if you were injured for 3 months, back for 2 months, then another 2 months, back for 1 month, then they were injured they could tear your contract up. There was a clause that changed really subtly. They just changed one word, And the boys and girls who were in that world had realised that and recognised that actually clubs now were starting to tear the contract of players who had had maybe 3 injuries in a year and they'd been out for over 6 months. They just touched that gap and they were gone, and it was ruthless. And they used it as well to get rid of players they didn't want their salary cap. So it became a bit of an interesting one where the good players, the guys who were out for 9 months and were playing for England or were doing whatever, or a great club player, they'd be looked after, they'd be fine. But it was another avenue to reduce salary cap, get rid of people they didn't want. And I just remembered that. It was a real subtle change midway through my career, which was pretty, that was, use the word nasty, totally legally fine. But as a player, you were like, oh shoot, the club don't love me as much as I thought they did, they're not going to stand by me. And that probably did impact a few players' performance on the field when they were a bit worried about, I've been out for 5 months, I don't need another month here. And that was probably, yeah, right, which is probably ironically a bit worse. If you're not going in full-hearted, you probably get put yourself in trouble. But there definitely was that sort of impact.
Right, I think we've got time for one more. If anyone's got the appetite for one more, there you go. Yeah.
Well, obviously he's in America, and they have not very different freedom of expression provisions, but it's one of their most absolute rights to do what they want. Whereas here, it's much more balanced against other rights.
So Toby to be leader.
Be a powerful statement, I'll tell you that much. I don't know what I'm campaigning against, we'll work it out.
Yeah, again, also, I think this is such a fireball of a question, but I think.
Have you not prepared for this one?
No, I didn't. It's just shockingly no. It's perhaps slightly less controversial here as well, and I think what you did see was maybe less legal remedies in that scenario and more like how can we protect our position commercially, because you couldn't necessarily fire him for that. There will be provisions in your contract about not bringing the game into disrepute and not defaming people, but something like taking the knee probably doesn't put you in that position, so there would be limited legal remedies that you could undertake.
But then on that point then, so would that not just show the power, because it was politicised heavily by Trump, would that then not show that to a point contracts are kind of negated due to political power, that sometimes, even though he'd done nothing wrong, he just had his own thought process, and then actually he was still within the remits of his club's contract, but then the political power of that meant that he wasn't renewed because of the pressure they were getting. I know that's slightly different tangent, but ultimately he was a great player, he would have been kept on, he would have been renewed, but he wasn't because of the politicalisation of a contract. And does that sometimes put that sort of juxtaposition between contracts and actual the politicalisation of those things and the pressure that comes from unions or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean none of these things are operating in a vacuum, right? So there's lots of reasons why we put provisions in contracts or why we set up projects in ways that maybe there's another way we could legally do something that might be easier for certain people involved, but because of pressures, like when we talk about the data stuff, for example, we do things in a way that, there's a maybe simpler way that we could do it that would make life easier for the regulator, but because we want to take account of how players feel and their representation, that we set it up in a different way that gets more people on board. And there'll be, contracts will always evolve. So one thing that we did see a lot of was after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we changed some of the reputation clauses for termination, because it wasn't necessarily like no one had done anything wrong in that scenario by the virtue of being in Russia or being connected to Russia, but there were political reasons why you might want to be able to get out of a relationship like that. So there will always be new things that come up in the life of a contract that can't be expected, and sometimes, more often than not, in fact, a non-legal route is going to be the better way for everybody to kind of get what they want out of that situation, whether it's an exit, whether it's compensation. The contract is kind of the last resort, really.
I love how you've rounded us off there. The last resort is effectively the last comment from a panel. Thank you all for your patience, your input, your attention, etc. But thank you to Roisin, Johnny, and Toby for fronting up to this audience and giving us some entertainment. Thanks ever so much.